Welcome to Citizens for Community Media with Mario Sims, Pastor Mario Sims, and Peter Helland. Mario was actually suggesting, maybe I mentioned why I called my show, the last one here, America's Biggest Lie, the Real Election Deception. Because we're going to go back, we call this show Local Corruption, okay? We're going to go back to when you were running for mayor in South Bend, 1994. I was the acting chaplain in the county jail here, St. Joseph County, South Bend, Indiana, Notre Dame. And basically what I started out the show saying, something that's so obvious, something that I said we just accept it as a given. Like we hold these truths to be self-evident, okay? You were running against Joe Kernan, who became governor.
Lieutenant governor and then governor.
Right. And I started out the show by saying, here's America's biggest lie. That we vote for a mayor, a governor, a school board member, and we vote for them with the expectation.
Judges.
Right. We vote for them with the expectation, the understanding, and I'm saying it's a false understanding, with the understanding that now their job is to represent us.
Right.
They are to represent our voice.
Right.
But hold it here. When King David sat on the throne of David, that throne was called the throne of God.
Right.
David was not there to represent the voice of the people.
Right.
And in fact, who was before David? Saul.
Yeah.
Why did God get rid of Saul?
Yeah.
Because instead of, Saul said, God said, well, how come you didn't obey me? He said, I feared the people and I obeyed their voice instead of yours. Adam obeyed, I would call it, the voice of the people. In fact, it was the voice of the people because there was only one person there.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right.
So instead of obeying the voice of God, he obeyed the voice of his wife. So the voice of the people is actually seen as a very bad thing, if at all it changes the voice of God.
Right.
Okay? So we have a system that elevates, doesn't even have God anywhere near that courtroom, anywhere near the government schools. God's voice isn't even considered. It's only the voice of the people. What's the problem with that?
Well,
I mean, you were running for mayor. I mean, of course, you had a transformation. I mean, you obviously grew up Christian.
But I was a prodigal son. Came up in a...
and by the way, we're the same age.
Right, exactly.
You're Chicago,
right.
I'm Wisconsin Dells.
Came up in, initially, my parents, middle-class black people, and so their preference was the Methodist Church, which was, you're not going to rock the boat. This was in the 60s.
Well, it's the biggest church
right.
in America for the longest time.
Right. So, and it was a church where if you wanted to be accepted as a middle-class black person, you attended a Methodist church because everybody looked down on the Southern Baptists, the blacks that were Southern Baptists, you know what I'm saying?
They took the Bible more seriously.
Well, it was how they behaved. I mean, they were speaking in tongues and they were dancing and shouting. So up north, then the Methodist church became the church of choice for at least my parents. I'm talking experientially with us, and you go and there's a sermon and there's one organ that plays and then you don't show any emotion and that was it. Well, that really wasn't that bad.
I think Hillary Clinton was a Methodist.
Yes, and she's from the Chicago area.
Right. So there'd be a similarity.
But later, my mom and dad divorced. My mom moved to the South, Mayfield, Kentucky, and I'm exposed to
Bible Belt.
Yeah, Bible Belt, Southern. In fact, my Aunt Marinelle was, man, if God said, give me one Christian woman, was my Aunt Marinelle, she wouldn't even allow a television. She wouldn't allow a television in her house.
Which was there was only one girl in my class, that's 140, that I knew of. that they didn't have a TV.
Yeah, she wouldn't allow
It was very
television.
strange.
Yeah, but that was her strongly held Christian belief.
But she wasn't in Chicago when your mom moved down there?
My mom moved to Mayfield, Kentucky.
And that's where your aunt was?
That's where my aunt and her husband, Uncle Burl, was at. Salt of the earth type people. During the summer, he delivered ice. During the winter, he delivered cold. She was a waitress. I mean, just salt of the earth people. Nothing flashy. They supplemented whatever their earning was, but they had probably a couple acre plot
She
of
was
land.
a success because, in other words, to keep the TV out of the home is massive success.
Well, I didn't, as a kid.
You wouldn't know.
I didn't understand that. In fact, there's a funny story. I got, she would always make sure, as long as my mom stayed there, she'd always make sure that church on Sunday, anybody in the house, and Baptist church, you started like 9 in the morning and you just went forever.
Like in Mississippi.
Yeah, you just went forever. And I remember one Sunday because there was a tradition back then among black families where if you had relatives in the South, you would send your kids to the South during the summer to keep them out of the streets of Chicago.
It's
every
a good tradition.
summer.
I didn't know.
Well, yeah, it was a tradition. So we make the journey, the 18-hour Greyhound bus ride, down through Illinois and then into Kentucky. And then here we are at my Aunt Marinelle's Uncle Burl. I've got a picture of her in the church, as a matter of fact. She's such a godly woman, but I didn't recognize that then. But one story, real quick, after about 3 or 4 Sundays of going to this, Baptist church all day on Sunday, I rebelled. And so it was time to go to church.
What are you, 13, 14?
12, 13, somewhere like that. So we leave the front door to head to the driveway where our car was at, and I take off running. I'm not going. And she was a pretty good sized woman. She's probably about, 6 feet tall. And so I figured I'd run about 10 or 15 feet. Well, I turned around, she's right behind me. She'd kicked her heels off and grabbed me by the collar and, "You're going to church," and threw me in the back of the car. And from that time, I went to church. But so as I got older, I would say I'm not going to go to church because that was my experience. Starch collars, the old, where you take the box of starch and put it in a container, and my mom would, starch a shirt.
Well, even when we were young, your best clothes were for church.
Exactly. So I'm setting this up to say I was a prodigal son. By the time I was an adult, I didn't want anything to do with church, and so I really, 1994 comes around. I had this spotty church attendance. I'm running for office. So I did what most politicians do. I'm running for office. I'd make sure I go to a church. And I'm going to Second Baptist Church, which is really, God had his hand on me because it was Reverend Sam Chase.
Oh, yeah, I know.
And Reverend Chase was, I call him my spiritual father. He's gone on to be with the Lord in 2005. But, and I'll kind of get to that later. But I was a prodigal son. But so 1994, 93, I'm outspoken. I at that point was said to have one of the highest profiles of any non-elected official. Chaired the Urban League, stepped down to run the Urban League interim executive director, executive committee of the NAACP. I had Father Malloy had appointed me to be the chairman of his neighborhood task force, where he brought the judiciary, the law enforcement, treatment together under one roof at Notre Dame. It was a great idea.
Let me interject a quick thought. One time in the Martin Luther King Club, Titus, who's passed,
Right.
Made this statement. He said, "Now, we all know, there's a bunch of men there." He said, "We all know that with the civil rights movement, the black men quit going to church.
Yes.
They all went quiet."
Yes.
2 years later, I brought it up again because I just thought, well, I need to refresh that point because there was no comment on it.
Right.
I said, "Titus, do you remember when you said that?" He goes, "Yes," and that's true. When the civil, he repeated it with this, exactly what he said before. So in other words, you're caught up in this,
Right.
which kind of there's a lot of good things about it. I'm not going to say the whole thing, but part of it captured you away.
What and here's
I don't
the thing.
mean you would reflect on that maybe.
Well, I mean, if you look back, you go into, and I hate to say a black church because as a pastor and as a Christian, there's no such thing as a black church, white church. You know, there is a church. Some churches tend to be predominantly of one, and I'm not going to say race, because as Paul said, from one man descended every man. But many times in the black community, instead of saying the black church, in the black community, what you'll find is women outnumber the men. In just about every church you go to that's in the black community.
Oh, yeah. I've heard people say that
that would be correct what Titus said. I mean, that's just...
But he's, well, of course, he was old. I mean, he's passed away now. He's older. So he saw...
Sure.
He could see the trend.
Now, remember when in the South with my Aunt Mary and Uncle Burl, you go to a church, a Baptist church then, families were there. The black men, the black woman, and the children. Families were there.
Right.
So I never really thought about what happened to cause this separation now. And Titus, your friend Titus, may have been right, because civil rights movement in 65, 66. And of course, Johnson came in with the New Deal where now the man because government is offering a stipend.
Well, we had a big discussion on this yesterday.
Well, that's the reality. I mean, and from New York, Chicago, the larger cities, social workers would go in, and they would even, if a man was there, they'd have to hide his shoes, and he couldn't be there when the social worker came in.
Well, like with Martin Luther King, his dad, I identify more with his dad than him theologically. Mm-hmm. His dad was an old-fashioned Baptist preacher. Martin Luther King goes to Boston University, where you get all the higher criticism, okay, which is I think Warnock.
Right.
Is that his church?
Took his church over, exactly.
See,
Ebenezer.
and he has all the liberal.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. The woke theology,
yeah.
which replaces the Bible.
Well, they get their education at these highfalutin universities, like at Notre Dame, where, you know, they teach evolution, and
which is it's astounding, but it's astounding. And you know, there was I saw a news story out of Ohio where a group of pastors. It caught my attention because a group of pastors were helping women get abortions, and I was just stunned. I was stunned.
No, I know there's a lot in the black church amongst the Christians that feel that basically these kids, I understand their point. Well, these kids are not going to have a father. They're not going to have a family, but they can be adopted.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't see how there's not that big a difficulty. There's a lot of people that can't have children.
Well, first of all, you know, and it's, you know, if my wife was here, she'd give her testimony. She was raped at 16, had a child, and I adopted that child when we got married. So I don't, because a lot of people say, well, you're a man, what do you know? Well, no, I mean, I have lived that out and adopted that child that she struggled from the time she was 16 to raise, refused to give the child up, even though she came up, you know, essentially impoverished in Chicago. So when people say that is some kind of snappy response to...
No, they're trying to fix the problem like David tried to fix his problem. His problem is he committed adultery with Bathsheba,
but
and now he got a bigger problem. Right. He's got a child, so they're going to know it wasn't the father, the dad.
Uriah's child, and that's
so he kills him.
Well, but see, and this is important as we have this discussion, because if you look at what happened with David, this is what you don't have today with our elected officials. Here comes Nathan, who was on David's staff. He had access to David. Okay, here comes Nathan. Now, if you have a spiritual, I don't know any politicians that have spiritual advisors, number one, because most of them will tell you, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't make my decisions based on Christianity. I can leave it. Well, that's ridiculous, okay? But Nathan came. See, what I would tell you, standing on the scripture, every elected official, no matter what position he has, needs to have a Nathan in his life. Well,
it was like when you were in the jail. They put you in the jail for that, 1994. I was the acting chaplain.
Right.
I would spend a lot of time talking with the officers.
Sure.
I mean, the officers working in the jail.
Right, exactly.
Also with the other men, because what's the difference? Yeah. They're all living there. I mean, they're all there.
Right, exactly. And everybody needs Jesus.
Right.
You know, and
And so I'm not going to, I can't give them a free pass.
right.
So I have to be, and some, you know, as you know, some people didn't like that.
Well, of course they did. What happened? They set you up. There's a pattern here, a broader pattern. They set you up. That someone asked you to bring a Bible because you used to have the Bible. You used to have the cart. You used to bring the cart around. I remember that. You'd bring them up to the bars.
I was the librarian. I came in through the Gideons,
Right.
and they were supposed to give me an office,
Right.
and the commissioners were supposed to allocate some money because I'm acting chaplain. I'm not getting paid. I don't
Right.
even have an office.
Exactly.
So I had an office for my job where Pat was running there on the corner.
Right.
Okay. And so people then would drop off new magazines. If you know, they could donate.
Right.
You know, and I would take in magazines, and the guy, you know, what they would do is they take the pages and slip in marijuana, you know, in the page, and then donate it, and you couldn't see it, and I would check everything.
Right.
It was common. You have to check for contraband. 'Cause that could,
Sure.
but I didn't catch it.
Right.
Okay, so when I came in.
Well, the world is shrewd. That's scripture. They're shrewder than the people of light. We don't think about things like that.
Well, I had never had any.
Well, we don't
I
think
had
about that.
thousands. I had
Right.
never caught anything.
We don't think about that.
Okay.
But Satan, and
Right.
and that's how they got you.
Well, then there was a kid that I used to substitute teach for at Adams,
Yes.
who was a guard.
Yeah.
And he goes, "Hey, a brand new." I was on trucking or something.
Yeah.
He said, "Oh yeah." I said, "Yeah, take a look at it. You know, I'll wait for you to browse through it." Boom. He sees that. Calls the new captain who had been disciplined. He was out on the streets,
Right.
and he messed up, and that's what they would do.
Right.
If you mess up, you're going in. You'll work in the jail now.
Right, right.
Okay. Well, he didn't like me. You know, I could come in at midnight. I could come. He didn't like the freedom I had.
Right.
Boom, out.
Well, you know, because we're talking about jail. How did I get there? And I just want to kind of give a little background. Was planning on running for mayor against Joe Kernan because I had taken a stand against corruption. My house got shot into twice. My wife at the time was a very introverted person. We had at that point, an 8-9-year-old child, and she wanted no part of public life. Well, I was, determined to make. I believed in America, and I'm a Marine, and I was incensed at the injustice, and we have to fight this. Well,
And you're in one of the most corrupt. I mean, what's the rumors about St. Joe County?
but you know what? Here's the thing. So we moved from Chicago. My mom lived here. She eventually moved from Kentucky, moved here. So I would come and visit her. And my wife and I, of course, lived in the suburbs of Chicago, had an office downtown. She worked for a bank. I was an executive recruiter. Our house was 32 miles from downtown, but it would take us 2 hours.
You were that far from downtown
Well,
Chicago?
32 miles. I lived in Hanover Park.
Okay.
And which should have been a half-hour drive, but with traffic and.
Well, that's quite a ways out.
Well, exactly. So 2 hours in the morning.
Whiting, Indiana is only 17 miles away.
I know, but here we are 32 miles from downtown, but it would take us 2.5 hours to get downtown. In fact, my wife worked at a bank. She couldn't be late, so she would take the Milwaukee Road commuter train. And then after work, we would come home. We just got tired of that. So we'd visit my mom and saw this tranquil life that my mom lived in South Bend. And we endeavored to move here, bought a house. It was for a couple years, it was nice. And then you had just criminality take over. Well, as I started complaining about it, I was told by the South Bend police the reason this was going on because it was protected by the then elected prosecutor, Mike Barnes. Mike Barnes was like J. Edgar Hoover. Everyone feared Mike Barnes. Everyone feared him. In fact, I was told that they couldn't protect me, that I had to go and get a carry permit. And many times I would sit in my living room when my son and my wife slept with my handgun on my lap to protect our house. Yeah, it got bad. We got death threats. Well, ultimately, my wife, and at one point, the second time my house was shot into, they shot in through the kitchen, and the bullet missed the gas line on the stove by about an inch.
Why were they shooting? Various reasons?
No. I mean, I was complaining about the corruption that was allowing drugs to flow.
So they could have been drug people.
Well, but as it turned out, that's a whole, that's a whole different area, according to police officers that knew, ultimately, that Mike Barnes profited. When I say profited from drug dealing, what happened was his brother-in-law at the time was a defense lawyer.
Was that Stanley?
Yeah, and I had drug dealers tell me this. His brother-in-law would have the drug dealers give them drugs, Rolex watches, that type of things, which Stanley would share with Mike Barnes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't forget. I talked to everybody in there all the time, and it was if they could get Stanley.
Right, but they always
were
told
set-
get Stanley.
they were set
and
to go.
So what Mike Barnes would do, if they catch you with what then was Class A amount of drugs, which was the highest felony then you would get sentenced to like 10 or 15, 20 years, and then a year later, Bill Stanley would file a sentence modification. Okay, so it appeared like Mike Barnes was hard on drugs. And the police officers, St. Joe County, Mishawaka, and South Bend pointed this out. They were incensed about this.
Barnes was a Notre Dame grad.
Yes.
And
Joe Kernan.
Yeah, and he was he liked the image of things.
Sure, but he was the epitome of evil. I mean, he was this area's J. Edgar Hoover. He had things on people. People were frightened of this man. I wasn't, though. And so ultimately there was so much pressure placed, the shooting of the house, and my mom was working for code enforcement part-time, and Joe Kernan had her fired because she was my son. Yeah, I mean, I was her son. So it was just a tremendous pressure around anyone new. Well, my wife at the time couldn't take it. She files for divorce. She wanted to have custody of our 9-year-old son, who didn't want. He and I were close.
What was your option? Move back to Chicago? Move to Kentucky? What was your option?
No, I'm determined at that time, committed to run for mayor.
Yeah, right. So you're already digging in, and
Right,
she didn't
yeah.
necessarily like that.
And she didn't want to do it. So she files for divorce. The marital house was, we had 3 rental properties. The marital property house was at the 1000 block of Johnson. We had 2 rental properties, 1025, 1029. The marital property was 1050 North Johnson. Then we had a
So
property.
they were not too far away.
Well, you could sit on the porch of the marital residence and see the rental properties. Okay, that's real close. So anyway, I moved into one of the rental properties. We continued to have sexual relationships. Well, one day I left, and a Friday I left after having sex with my wife at the time, right? Even though the divorce was pending. And she would do, we would share custody. I'd have my son for 2.5 days, she'd have him, or 3.5 days, she'd have him 3.5 days. So there were times I would go down to the house, ring the doorbell, and she wouldn't come to the door, and a South Bend police car would come up. And she would call the police and say that I'm ringing her doorbell excessively, even though I'm there to get my son.
She's doing a typical.
Well, okay, I didn't put it together. Okay, I didn't. I just thought, divorces tend typically not to be amicable. Well, it was that kind of. It wasn't the War of the Rose type thing, but it was contentious at that point.
Sure, it was contentious.
And so one Friday, I'm at the house with her. We have sex. I leave. It's a Friday evening. I go home. I wake up, and there's a recording on my voicemail. Officer of South Bend Police said, "Hey, we need to talk to you." I called my attorney, David Albert, who used to be a priest and then went to law school. And David's take was, look, this has been a problem all along. She's been harassing you. Let's go. So I go, and they say, hey, your wife said that, they wanted to know, were you at your wife's yesterday? Yes. Did you guys have sex? Yes. And they said, well, stand up, turn around. They charged me with burglary and rape. Okay. Now, criminal lawyers had said if you had never said that you had sex with her, they couldn't prove it because it was your wife, right? But, David was a priest. I believed in, well, it's my wife. Well, I got charged, okay, with 4 felonies.
And the election is how far away?
1995. So it's a year away.
Still a year away, but you've already announced.
Already announced,
Okay.
yeah. In fact, there's a Tribune article in February when I was arrested saying that this is politically motivated. because what had happened was they had claimed at trial that I had broken into the house before 3:30 and then sexually molested my wife. Unfortunately for them, I was at the Heritage Cable studio,
Yeah, which became Comcast.
which was on Hickory and
it was near
Hickory
and Edison.
Edison, with Dave Frank. Dave Frank and I had a radio show. We'd do it during the day, and then we would go and tape our television show, cable
Stand Up
television
America
show,
or what?
Stand Up America. And so we're in the studio from 2 to 4. There was no way I could have been in the house before. But I didn't, at trial, I didn't have, my attorney didn't call any witnesses. I'd never been charged with a crime before, and I just figured the truth was going to set you free. I didn't rape my wife, but I got convicted. And evidence had been planted. When I went to the police station on a Saturday, in response to the voicemail message or on my answering machine, my next door neighbor who was attendant, Candace Tompkins, I asked her, I had my son, and I asked her, could you watch my son, thinking I'm going to go give a statement and come back. Well, I didn't come back for 3 months because I had to raise bond. She gave me an affidavit saying, well, when I was at your house, I saw your watch, a brown band leather watch on the floor. I picked it up and put it on your desk. Well, I never went back to the house. The police came 2 days later, searched, and the watch ended up being introduced into evidence as I dropped it on the back porch of a woman who said she gave me a handgun. Okay. So, long story short, I get convicted. They have a jailhouse snitch, Lionel Williams, who claims that I told him that I did it.
Is behind this, you think, the powers that be are trying to get rid of you?
Well,
like you got Barnes and you got Kernan, who
Absolutely.
are very, and they just said, this guy's
this
guy's trouble. Can we get him off our back?
Gwen Steins, who used to be a substance abuse supervisor or something with the South Bend schools, I had gotten the Alive with Service Award. Joe Kernan hated me, so he had Steve Lickey, who was the assistant, or he was the first district city councilman, then present the award. Well, at that breakfast, Gwen Stein said, Mario, I need to talk to you. It was at the Century Center. So we walked down the hallway, and she said, I've been told they're going to plant evidence on you. They're going to plant drugs on you. Now, I was a recovering alcoholic, so we thought that was the direction they were going to come. So I began secretly drug testing every month at the South Bend Clinic. So if they tried to plant evidence, we could show, but they came a different route. Ultimately, they promised my wife at the time custody of my child.
Oh yeah, that was, you guys were having a contentious.
They told her, well, if you make this allegation, it will impact his ability to get custody, and then you could drop the charges. Well, once she made the allegation,
state picked him up.
They told her, if you try and drop these charges, we're going to charge you. Okay, yeah, she's going to charge you. She told my cousin Demetra that. Okay. And they said they're going to charge me. So long story short, got convicted, sentenced to 27 years by Judge Jeannie Jordan. Now a year later, because I didn't have any witnesses and I didn't begin not trusting lawyers, I went to prison. In fact, I was down at Indiana Youth Center where Mike Tyson was at. I met Mike. That's a whole nother story. But I started studying the law and discovered that I had the evidence to show that there was evidence that had been planted. This jailhouse snitch had gotten a deal from Barnes to be released. And, Dave Frank gave me an affidavit saying, hey, he was here on camera. He couldn't have been there. I gave that to the Court of Appeals. Court of Appeals sent me back in front of my trial judge, Judge Jordan. She denied it. And
that's when I would see you again in the jail.
Right, exactly.
When you say you sent me back,
right,
back to the county jail.
The case should have been reversed at that point. She denied it and said, because they brought my trial lawyer, and he testified, because Judge Jordan said, well, you had all this evidence, why didn't you present it? And he told the court, well, Mario didn't want to work with me. So her position was, you had all this evidence, you didn't give it to your lawyer, go back to prison. So December, this is now a year after my conviction, December, I filed another motion showing this time, in addition to everything, because my ex-wife, now ex-wife at the time, I subpoenaed her and she testified. I couldn't have broke in through the front door because the front door had triple locks on it. They were locked before, during, and after.
Before I forget the thought, Jeannie Jordan was famous amongst all the inmates for you know what.
Yeah.
That her, I mean, if I get it right, her daughter had been raped by a black man.
I didn't know this until after.
I'm sure they set this up.
Well, they steered me to that. I mean, this was full court pressure to get me convicted, right?
And I knew a girl. I was actually supposed to. I just got a text. I was supposed to be in Uganda visiting. Okay, this is a black girl from Uganda, a lawyer, came here on a Fulbright, and she was destined. I mean, she is very high. She got her PhD, so she's very high up there. And she told me she could not be a judge because if she ever got a sexual case, she would go nuts.
Yeah.
Okay, she would emotionally lose it.
Well, Judge Jordan never disclosed, and so it just turned out during the time I was back, one of the young black guys goes, "You shouldn't be in front of Judge Jordan." I go, "Why?" In the jail. And he goes, "Because I used to date her daughter, and I used to have to meet her daughter at the University Park Mall, so they're picking her at home because she had been sexually assaulted by a black guy, and her mom hated black guys." Well, so I get an affidavit, and so the second remand, I file that. She gets off the case, sends it to Elkhart. An Elkhart special judge by the name of Donald Jones looks at the case and said, "Well, this should have been taken up with the Court of Appeals. I'm denying it." The Court of Appeals sent me back. So he denies it. That was in 1995. So I'm in prison for the next 12 and a half years. I get out 2006.
Are you at Michigan City at this point?
I was at Westville.
Westville.
At that point, yeah. Get out in 2006 and resume in the community, and so 2013, my wife and I found Doulos Chapel. I'm a pastor. 6 years later, I'm at the church one day, and I get a phone call from an NBC reporter out of Fort Wayne, Alexis Shear.
Well, you got out in 2006?
December of 2006, right?
And then immediately you were on...
I did Faith of Our Fathers with you for 4 or 5 years.
We did it quite a while.
We did for a long time, maybe longer than that, exactly. The good news is, and this is what I want to say, I realized that in running for mayor, I wasn't saved. I wasn't walking in my salvation. And so I had this hunger. When I got to prison, I had this hunger for the Word of God. I went through three Bibles that literally fell apart, okay? And I would go to prison fellowship and the programs that you would come in. I don't know if you came in through prison fellowship, but you would come in.
The lady was Poindexter and the lady that taught at IUSB.
Right, exactly. You would come in, and I just had this hunger. So I started going to any of the teachings that were, approved by the Bible.
Desire the sincere milk of the Word that you may grow thereby.
So by 1999, I'm teaching a Bible study. What had happened was I was going to a Bible study every day in prison, and then the intercom comes on in 1999, and they moved the guys teaching the Bible study, and we're sitting there, about 15 inmates, and they're going, "Well, I'm looking like who's going to teach the Bible study?" And they go, "You're always studying the Bible." So I start teaching the Bible in prison. So I get out, and the administration, even doing lockdowns, would let me out into the day room to teach the Bible study. Because
they saw that was a good thing to do.
Right. And initially the first 3 years, from 94 to 97, I'm fighting to come home. I'm studying the Bible and I'm fighting to come home and I'm praying God release me. And God said, "No, you're not ready." And of course I didn't
surrender.
I didn't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I mean, but I'm doing all this, and he goes. I remember one day I got an order from the court that was negative. In 1997, when I read it, I picked my Bible up and I was going to throw it down. And I heard the voice of God say, "If you throw it down, where are you going?"
Yeah. Like somebody commented on the YouTube and, he's like an atheist. And I quote that passage in, where was it? one of the Gospels, and Jesus says to Peter, you know, they're all leaving.
Right, right.
Well, are you going to leave too? And
Yeah.
Peter goes, you're the only one that's got the words of eternal life. Where else is there to go?
Yeah, yeah.
There is no other place to go.
Yeah. And so with me, I realized, so I began serving him in prison. I would minister to Aryan brothers, neo-Nazis, outlawed bikers, you know, gangster disciples, and minister to them.
Because they still had some respect.
Well, what God taught me was this. He goes, I need somebody 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, so these men could see.
Because they think everything's phony.
Well, yeah, that's it.
They don't trust a
well,
thing.
Of course.
It's all the devil's world.
Well, some of the homosexual inmates would tell me, you know, Brother Sims, a lot of the people you go into church with are trying to get me in the shower. You know, so my thing was, I want to be authentic. And it got to the point, I was at Westfield for 9 years of my 12 and a half years, and the guards knew me. And they used to joke, you know, we could leave the door open and you're not going to walk out. And a lot of times they would do shakedowns of inmates, because if you had like juice, the guys would bring them back, sneak in their clothes and bring them back and make hooch with.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So as we're leaving the chow hall, I would open my coat and the guards would like, just get out of here. We know you don't have any contraband, you know. Long story short, I get out in 2006. We do Faith of Our Fathers for a number of years.
Yeah, because we were in touch. We were in touch. You know,
Right. You would come.
if you had a hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. You would come to Marshall County or to Michigan City, LaPorte.
Yeah, Michigan City or
That
LaPorte.
kind of, as I'm fighting my case. And the doors slamming by the judiciary.
Because it was
so-
very obvious that there was something wrong.
Well, but
I mean, I could not like.
right, exactly. I mean, the guards would say, "Come on, you got 27 years for raping your wife. Come on, they would say that's not you." So it was obvious that something is terribly wrong with this conviction. It was obvious to everybody except for the judges.
Yeah, I mean, you weren't saved. You weren't walking with the Lord. But you're running for mayor. You're not trying to live like a thug.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing. I remember I have a friend whose wife sent me. I got a Bible in January 1995, first Bible in my life. It came in the mail, and I had a friend, Colin Baylor, who was my son had played with his son, and we were never close. But when I got to prison, he's like, "I'll send you some books, you know, if you want." He'd go to the library, the book sale, used book sale, and send me books. Well, his wife sent me my first Bible, and I remember calling to thank them, and she answered the phone. Eva had grown up in Africa. I don't remember what country. Had never. If you asked her, like, Leave It to Beaver, she never saw television, because she was a missionary in Africa, right? Her family was Mennonites. And so she had to come back to Cleveland Clinic when she was 30 because she had some illness. But anyway, I called to thank her. She answered the phone, and I said, "Thank you for the Bible." And I said, "You know, I can't wait to get home and finish my work." Eva talks real slow, and she said something that just shook my world. She said, "Mario, it's not your work. It's God's work." And I went, pow. See, I wasn't saved, and I'm going to run for mayor, and I got to.
No, that's where you ended up with Dulos Chapel, because you understood.
Yeah.
This is the revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the voice of the people.
Yeah. So,
I mean, see the parallel? How our political system is
Sure.
also hijacking the church?
and we'll get there. Let me say this. Genesis 50:19. I read it one day, and it just grabbed me. Joseph, who had been falsely charged with rape, said in front of his brothers, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good." I thank God for my journey, because I don't know if he would have been able to reach me any other way. I got saved in prison.
Well, you know the guys in jail, they always say, you know, they got shot 9 times. And he said it took 9 bullets.
Yeah.
I mean, they survived.
Yeah.
But it took
Yeah.
9 bullets to
Yeah.
get them to surrender.
Well, and that was
We
it
all
with
are
me.
fighting in a way.
Exactly. So this all happens, and I'm at the church. It's April 2019. I get a phone call from Alexis Shear. She used to be a reporter with, I think, Fox in here in South Bend, but now she's moved on to Fort Wayne. She calls me around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, April 2019. She says, "Are you at the church?" And I go, "Yeah." And she goes, "I'm heading over there." So about 15 minutes later, she comes in with another reporter, Tom, and a cameraman. And she goes, just wait a minute. We go in my office, and she has a cameraman set up the camera, and then she gets me mic'd up, and she goes, I just left Tim Corbett. Tim Corbett was back in 1994, a sergeant in the South Bend Police Department. He was well known as a doer of dirty deeds for Mike Barnes. And she said, Tim Corbett told me that he had planted evidence to get your conviction. And I sat there and I didn't know whether to cry or whether, I knew God was going to play a role, but I didn't know he was going to have Tim Corbett confess.
He had just said that to her that day?
Yeah, she just came from there.
Ah.
And she said, I used to believe everything Tim Corbett said about you. You raped your wife, you're a terrible person. So Tim Corbett felt comfortable around her. Okay, because somebody said, why would he's that stupid? Well, he's arrogant.
Pride comes before a fall.
Yeah, pride becomes before the fall. And so she said, this is what he said. And she said, I want to do a story about this. So she started asking me, how do you feel? When I go, I knew that this was going to happen. I didn't know it was going to happen like this with him. This is the best way. He's the person who.
Because I had never. I knew a lot about what was the case,
Right.
But I need, like, you're refreshing me. But I don't remember hearing that per se. Was that out there before she said this?
I didn't. I knew I didn't do it.
Right, but you had never heard of that before.
Yeah, I knew the case had been fabricated, but I didn't know the details.
But we didn't know any details.
Right, like that. So I was stunned. And then so halfway through the interview, her phone rings, and she tells the cameraman, hold on a minute, I got to step out. So she steps out in the lobby. She comes back, and she says, we got to go. I just talked to my station managers. I am now a witness to a crime. Evidence planting is a crime. And she said, we got to go. She said, don't do anything for a week. I got to find out what they want me to do. So I go, fine. So I didn't hear from her for a week. And I call her, I go, Alexis, I haven't heard anything. She says, Mario, I got to move out of Indiana. Tim Corbett has threatened my life. And she said, do whatever you want to do. Go ahead and get the story out, okay? I won't deny it. It turned out she called Derek Dieter, who is now a county commissioner, who was a police officer for like 30 years and was president of the South Bend City Council.
Yeah.
Derek told me that when she called me and told me Tim Corbett had planted the evidence, I almost wrecked my pickup truck. He was so stunned. She called Pat Cottrell, who is the president of the Board of Public Safety. He handled discipline for law enforcement officers. And Pat had also been a SWAT teammate. Pat tells me later on, Mario, I liked Tim, I knew Tim, I was his SWAT teammate, but no police officer should set someone up. And so Pat called Jesse Davis, the activist Jesse Davis, and also called, because she didn't trust the South Bend police, she called an Elkhart police officer who used to be South Bend police by the name of David Hackett and made a verbal report. David Hackett, in turn, contacted his lieutenant, who told him to contact Internal Affairs, who did nothing with this. Okay, so I immediately got lawyers. One of my lawyers is Tom Godfrey, who is a prosecutor in LaPorte County. Tom and I sat and met, and as I was telling you earlier, we met 3 times. The first time we sat for an hour and a half, he got details of my case. He asked me the files, give him the files. He'd come back a month later, and he'd talk and take notes. And then the final time he came back and said, I was a prosecutor in LaPorte County. I asked questions about your case. I didn't tell anybody I represented you. He said there's some terrible things done to you that you don't even know that were done.
That he discovered.
He uncovered. He said, I'll take your case. He was joined by Attorney John Ulmer, who was a Elkhart police Elkhart County Deputy Sheriff for 20 years, headed the Elkhart County Drug Task Force, and then became a lawyer. Okay, so we're not talking about guys that are just out of law school. We're talking about one's a prosecutor, one was a police officer before being an attorney, and they're just blown away. This is what they're blown away about. Fast forward to now. We filed the lawsuit. They were and the lawsuit was that what Tim Corbett has said, but then we find out that if you remember the South Bend police tapes, how this plays into assisting me in overturning my conviction, that it was made known to me that Karen DePape, who was the director of communications for the South Bend Police, who was the only person that heard all the police tapes, had in her lawsuit been deposed by two city attorneys, Stephanie Steele and Crystal Briscoe. One was the corporation counsel, the other was a senior official. And they asked her 15 questions. She told them that she had overheard in these tapes police officers laughing about evidence being planted in my case and in other defendants' cases. This was exposed by the Young Turks in September of 2019. So we filed a lawsuit. We put in what Alexis told us, which should have been enough. When you have an admission, a police officer planted evidence, that should be enough. But then he threatens the life of a reporter.
Well, have you ever seen a police officer sworn in up at the Board of Public Safety? I think I've been there. Mm-hmm. Don't they make a vow never to lie?
Yeah. But so
before God, they make a vow.
The guy's still a police officer. What happened is the corruption in the courts took place. The case was John Broden got on the case. John Broden, of course, was city attorney. You talk about that relationship, the incestuous relationship. He was a former Indiana senator, Democratic senator. Okay.
They do this for national security, local security.
He was the chairman of the Democratic Party. Now you would expect to have integrity. Okay, you would expect him to have integrity. But what he did was essentially, he said we filed the suit in September. He waited until the other side never filed anything, never denied anything. To this day, they haven't denied anything. John Broden, playing defense attorney, takes the robe off, becomes defense attorney, says, hey, has been heard before, but it couldn't have been. It just happened in 2019. It's never been before the court.
Right, that's what you sent me.
Yeah. So now the Court of Appeals, in backing John Broden, the order where he said this has been heard before, the Court of Appeals determined that was a clerical error. There's nothing in the record that says it's a clerical error. Nothing.
Well, Barnes was on the appeals court.
Barnes assigned himself to the appeal, which, okay, that's how crazy this is. Assigned himself to the appeal. So now we're in front of
I'll tell you this, these guys, my dad's a lawyer, of course, and I grew up with judges and everything. Mm-hmm. Some of those guys are obsessed about making themselves look squeaky clean.
Well, and that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. That what has happened now is it's gone from just Tim Corbett to now you have two city attorneys. You have, of course, Pete Buttigieg, who's running for president, who was made aware what was said on the tapes by Karen DePape, along with the head of the Indiana Democratic Party, Mike Smuel, in addition to the two women, Stephanie Steele and Crystal Briscoe, who were city attorneys then, who've now been made judges by our governor, okay? And attorneys have an ethical requirement to expose the criminality that was heard. I mean, Tim Corbett committed a crime. And so here we are in front of the Indiana Supreme Court, placing all of this information and even filing a motion for sanctions, which I provided to you, which is unopposed. And it's saying, look, they have never denied that they did this. They've never said we didn't do it. They just rely on the courts,
to do their Masonic handshaking.
Well, let me read something real quick. I'm Romans 13. It says, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. They're supposed to be ministers of God.
Right, and I read that earlier out of the book Wisdom of Solomon,
Yeah.
chapter 6, where it says, if you're in a position of authority, you're going to be really judged with a lot more scrutiny. James chapter 3 says
They don't
the same
care.
thing.
All of these people are Christians. They're all, you know.
That's what they would say.
Well, of course.
And they'll go to church and they'll...
All of them will go to church. All of the Stephanie Steele, Crystal Briscoe, John Broden.
Because they
Mike
want that
Barnes.
image at least.
But it's all an image. And they sell it to the people, so people think, oh, well, we're in good hands. Well, what are you basing it on the Constitution? Are you basing it on the Scripture? Where people in authority are supposed to be ministers of justice. What I'm saying to you is not a minister of justice. You know, Peter, it's an offense to me because I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I served this country, the same country now that is attacking me. I'm an American citizen. I don't, you know, we have people in the military that every day are fighting to defend our rights or assisting other countries to have what we call democracy, when here in South Bend, Indiana, St. Joe County, we don't have it. And no media. It's one thing to talk about the courts, but you had a mainstream media member whose life was threatened, and you can't get one story about this, not only in the local media, but the national media.
That's why we tried to keep the public access going.
Yeah, if it wasn't for you today, many people wouldn't know this story. You really need to think about this so-called Christian country and what is going on in South Bend and St. Joe County.
Outward circumcision, which is in a sense what they have. They have
Right.
the outward Christianity, but the prophet said you need to be circumcised in your heart.
Yeah.
And then the New Testament brought it fully to home.
Not one elected official. And you know, the same information I sent you, our petition for transfer, their response, our reply, and a motion for sanctions for them lying. There's a motion for sanctions before the Indiana Supreme Court saying, hey, they lied about all this. They haven't denied this. I sent it to every elected official in St. Joseph County, and not one has said we're going to stand up and demand justice for this man.
They don't even feel they need to?
Well, maybe they're afraid.
Probably afraid. I read it to you earlier. It says, because he's talking about anybody in authority, because as servants of his kingdom you did not rule rightly, or keep the law, or walk according to the purpose of God. He will come upon you terribly and swiftly, because severe judgment falls on those in high places. That's a theme. And if you were smart, you would fear God and not lie, keep your oath. You promise not to lie.
Right.
Now, why don't they?
I mean, if you're asking me for an answer why, the only thing I can think is, Tim Corbett said, okay, when this whole thing came out the tapes, he said, if I go down, I have a lot of information on other people. They're going to go down too.
But going down would be good for their soul.
Well, it was good for mine. Genesis 50:19. What they intended for evil, God made me into. God crumbled me. He crushed me.
Well, remember when you were in the jail, I said, Mario, I believe you. I don't believe, And I told a lot of guys. A lot of guys would say, I'm in here for, I'm not in here. I didn't do what they say I did. But I said, well, here's the question.
Right.
Were you doing things in the sight of God
Right.
that were grievously wrong?
Yeah, and see, that's what I came to understand as I'm in prison and I'm saying, God, but look at what they're doing. God, I remember one day it's like God had this big screen and he had it on so he could with a remote control, and he kept saying, but look at what you did in your life. Look at the sins you've committed. Look at the sin. I'll take care of them. And so what he did was he taught me to humble myself, to become contrite. Okay.
Right.
And
it brought you out of that just the civil rights mindset, my rights.
right.
And then you said, but your duties, Mario.
Yes.
Your spiritual duties
Yes. Yeah.
to keep your soul undefiled.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had people say, if you get your case overturned, you want to run from. No, I have a greater influence, I believe, with the souls of people as a pastor than I ever could as an elected official. I just think that for people to trust government, that justice should be demanded in this case, because I'm not the only person they did it to.
They need to be warned that they are going to face judgment day.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus said every idle word you speak is going to be judged. It says, let not many of you become masters, my brother. That's talking about teaching the word.
Yeah.
But if you want to run for mayor, you ought to do it with fear and trembling.
Yeah, and they didn't, and now they're trying to cover it up. And God is exposing that thing he did with Tim Corbett. He's exposing it. We even went to the FBI here locally, and because I was getting, when Tim Corbett ran for sheriff, I was getting death threats. They were recorded on my phone. And I went to the FBI, and I never forget the agent in South Bend coming out. I played it, and he goes, "What are you doing to get these death threats?" And then he went back inside and slammed the door, and I thought.
Well, what's it say in Ephesians? Our job is to expose the works of darkness.
And that's what
Isn't
I'm
that
doing.
a job of a Christian?
Yes.
To expose the works of darkness?
Yes, because everybody else is afraid. And I don't fear the one that are doing this. I fear the one who could cast the soul and the spirit into hell. I fear God. You know, the thing is, not by my power, not by my might, but the arm of the Lord.
Right.
That's what I'm standing on.
We do it in fear and
Yeah.
trembling. We don't test the Lord.
Yeah. I think we have about a minute left here. Is that
yeah.
about right? Oh,
Yeah.
2 minutes. Okay, good.
Well,
So I'm fighting, and I believe God's going to deliver justice.
right, and the hard position to take for everybody, every Christian, bless those who persecute you,
Yes.
bless,
Yes.
and curse not.
You know, and I'm not angry at anybody. In fact, I pray for those people that I've mentioned. I pray for them because you have a position of trust. You're supposed to be ministers of justice, and all you're doing is degrading this position that you have, which is why we're having problems in America. Every institution in America now is being challenged because they're being exposed.
Right, and so if they really understood what was happening to their soul, they'd be fearful
Yes.
where that soul could go.
Well, I'm hoping the power of God works in such a mighty way that fear will come in their life.
Yeah, because you're not a political threat.
Right.
You're being a pastor and a minister of the word.
Yeah.
Good. It's good to hear part of the story.
Well, I thank God for you, and I thank God for this opportunity, brother.
Okay.
All we can do is give the truth. Now it's up to them to decide what they're going to do
Yep,
with it.
and we'll keep praying.
Amen.
Peter Helen with Mario Sims on Citizens for Community Media in South Bend, Notre Dame.
God bless you.